Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back in the second lesson of our exploration of the Old Testament. As I said last week, this is very complicated. It's 4 times the size of the New Testament. So I'm going to be doing a little more highlights, skipping various areas. And there's certain sections we don't want to spend a lot of time on, like the heavy legalisms of Leviticus. So today we're going to take on, which is a challenge for some people, which are the early part of Genesis for the first 11 chapters. And, you know, this has been a controversial point to a number of people in our society and for a long time. And it's been very controversial. It got into legal fights. The most famous, of course, was the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee in the 1920s, where Scopes was a young teacher who was prosecuted for teaching evolution, which was illegal in Tennessee at the time. And he was defended by Clarence Darrow, the great lawyer, and he was prosecuted by William Jennings Bryan, who was a great man, a true Christian gentleman. And in that trial, the famous scene was they actually had William Jennings Bryan go on the witness stand. Clarence Darrow cross-examined him and asked him about the creation. Was it in 7 days? And he said, "Oh yes, I believe it." And he said, "But it wasn't necessarily a 24-hour day." Darrow kind of perks up because he found even that the great believer in Bible literacy interpreted it as to what it really meant, because a day on Earth is 24 hours, but a day on Mars is different, a day on Jupiter is different. And so we end up interpreting it. There are still parts of Christianity who teach this as absolute fact. I don't, and people, I've not run into people really having problems with it. But what is this teaching? This teaching is what I call explaining the unexplainable. These are from very primitive folklore that has been passed down over the centuries, many centuries. And this was their attempt to explain where the world and human beings and life and sin and misery and lust and anger and jealousy all came from. So they're attempting to explain the unexplainable. And all sorts of different ethnic groups have different types of these types of creation stories, mythology, however you want to phrase it. I am not familiar as a student with them. I've read a little bit about some of the Native American mythologies, and they've been pretty well studied by scholars, so that information is out there. I think the Navajos have the creation from people coming up from the underworld to create life on Earth. As we know, there's really no life beneath the surface of the Earth. As we're getting deeper and deeper in some of our minds, it's getting hotter and hotter from the hot rock that's underneath it. So this was an attempt to explain where humans came from, where life came from, where the universe came from, and it's extraordinarily complicated. And we're now finding the universe is enormous. You know, when I was in high school was when the Big Bang Theory came out. And then it's been refined a lot, and we've had space telescopes which show that there's billions of galaxies around with have billions of stars. Turned out creation was far more complicated than any of us had any idea. In the old days, people thought that the earth was created. And if you read, there's 2 accounts in Genesis about the creation. The first chapter is the one that's most quoted, is a very orderly fashion in which man is created last. And the world they envisioned was the understanding of the world really until about 15 to 1600 in Europe. And you had, they believed there was a flat earth, and it was surrounded by water. Water brings life. You can't have life without water. And so they thought the water was all around beneath the earth, because you can go down in a well and get water out, that it was above the earth, and there was a firmament, is what they called it, a dome over the earth, and on that dome were attached the sun and the moon and the stars, and they rotated around as the dome moved. And so they had an earth-centered universe with these various things attached to this dome, the firmament, and that's what they believed. Now, there was a guy in 300 or so BC who came up with a hypothesis that it was really the sun was the center of the universe, and Earth rotated around the sun. And that was an attempt to explain, because certain of the stars, the planets, wandered and they didn't have the same orbits. because as their orbit intersects with our orbit, they move around the sky. And but no one really, and his theory was just one of observation. He just logically assumed that, but it died out and no one paid any attention to it. And then when Copernicus came along about 1500, and he figured it out mathematically that the sun had to be at the center of our universe and the planets revolved around the sun in their own way. And that's why the planets that we can see Venus is the most visible. We can see Saturn and Jupiter, and sometimes Mars. And they wandered because they were orbiting the sun also. So he came up with a sun-centered universe, not the Earth-centered universe that you have here. So the first chapter is the priestly account, and it's very matter of fact, and it ends with man being created last. When I say the priestly account, remember what we talked about last week? I'm certain everybody remembers everything about it. That the first 5 books, the Torah, were put together in an organized and beautifully organized fashion during the Babylonian exile, sometime between 590 BC and about 500 BC. If you remember, if you've ever had the class before, some of you have, the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom, Judah, several times in the 590 range, and took most of the population off the capital, Babylon, which is in Iraq, where Iraq is now, in captivity. And in that community there, the priest basically took over. The secular leaders had all been killed off by the Babylonians. Babylonians were a nasty, nasty bunch. And they had killed off all the secular leaders, and the priest became the leader of the community. And so when Cyrus the Persian conquered them and let them go back home, they went back as an organized, religiously dominated community. But in that time in Babylon, they took the various sources of information they had and blended it brilliantly into what is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they put the other later books in with it also. And so the scholarship has realized that there's 4 major tracks that have contributed to that part of the Old Testament, the first 5 books. There's the priestly track, and that's first Genesis, and you get in the 5th chapter of Genesis, you'll find when you have all these lists of genealogies, you'll have all these legal structures. These are from the priestly community, and how they preserve their knowledge over the time is unclear. Nobody really knows, but it's written into the text and blended very nicely. Then you have 2 that are the old epic, and these were the stories of creation, like the Navajo one I mentioned, told around the campfire for thousands of years and remembered orally. They're called J and E. J is the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah's mythology, and it deals with the old epic, and it uses the term Yahweh, which is where the J comes from, for God as the God's name that we'll see in the Moses account. The other one of the old epic is called the E account, or Elohim, because they use the term Elohim, which is the generic word Lord in Hebrew for God, and God doesn't have a name in that account. And that's from the northern kingdom of Israel, which has disappeared after they were conquered by the Assyrians in 720 BC, before the second kingdom fell. They have a different holy mountain, that's Mount Horeb. And the 4th account is the Deuteronomic history. This really starts in Deuteronomy and runs through Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And it's a lengthy history. It was discovered about 640 BC in a scroll in the temple under the reforms of good King Josiah. So those are the 4 tracks, and they're blended together beautifully. But you do find a second creation story. When you go to Genesis chapter 2 and start at verse 4, here's the second creation story, which is really the old epic. This is the J and E story blended together. The old epic told around the campfire for hundreds or thousands of years as to where man came from, because in that, God is a physical presence. God is a physical being that walks in the garden with them. And man is created first. Before the animals, before the plants and trees, God makes him out of the soil and breathes life into his nostrils. And then man is created first, and God makes this garden in Eden. Eden is a land to the east. These mythologies look to the east for their great stories, and because Abraham actually had come from the east, and he creates the garden for him with all these trees. He can eat the fruit. And then he recognizes that the man is lonely, so he creates a woman for him, taking a rib from man. He created animals before then and birds, and he creates Eve from the flesh of Adam. And while Adam's in a deep sleep, and Eve becomes his companion. It shows this is where the natural male and female gender comes from, because we do have that. And it's universal on the earth, male and female, in all species. And she becomes the companion, and they talk about the garden specifically. Now, there are two famous trees in the garden. One is the tree of life, and that's what gives life to the garden, and that's not the tree of the sacred fruit. The tree of the sacred fruit is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is really an attempt to explain, why do humans have evil in the world? Because there's lots of evil in the world. There's lots of evil inside each of us, varying degrees in certain people, but it's to deal with the question of good and evil and other questions that trouble us. And so God tells them you can't eat that fruit, and the snake induces the woman to try the fruit. He tempts her. He says, basically, you'll become like God if you eat this fruit. You'll know the knowledge of good and evil. So she eats it, gives it to Adam, her husband, and he eats it. And then they recognize that they're naked. This is the emergence of lust and the problems that lust can produce in certain people, more in certain people and less in others. And they recognize they're naked, so they make loincloths out of the leaves and hide from the Lord. And there's my favorite scripture in the Old Testament is, and the Lord was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And I thought, what a beautiful phrase, even in translation. But this is the God who's a physical presence in the garden at the time. Very different than the absent but powerful God of the first chapters, which is the priestly account. And he says, why are you hiding? And they said, well, we know we were naked. He said, how do you know you're naked? Did you eat of the forbidden tree? And yes, and this and that. So he banishes them from the garden. This is explaining why life is not easy, why we have to work to tend the soil in those days, hunt the animals, while we have pain, suffering, pain in childbirth, a wide variety of suffering. And this is an explanation. Again, explaining the unexplainable, why life is difficult, why humans are angry, why humans can be evil, why we have these various curses like lust and other things like that. And so they have the expulsion from paradise, and we have to go out and work. The next story is about their children, Cain and Abel. Cain is the elder of the two sons, and Abel is the second of the two sons. And Abel becomes the favorite younger child, which is actually a theme that appears more than you think in the Old Testament, because you have several other younger children that are favored. Jacob is the younger of the twins. He's favored over his brother Esau. Joseph is the younger of all of the 12 tribe children. He's the youngest, and he's the favorite. King David was the youngest child in his family. So it's an interesting thing that you find, even that far back, you find the youngest, and Isaac, Abraham's son, is younger than his half-brother Ishmael. So you find the younger son being favored, but it's the favor of God. It's the favor of God giving you extra talent. David was multi-talented. And so Abel is favored, and his brother is jealous, and he kills him. And this is the explanation of why you have violence in life. Why are we violent with each other? There's certainly lots of violence. Humans kill each other all the time. They have since the beginning of time. And it's a real curse on our existence. And this is an explanation of why. This is human rivalry and nastiness and all that stuff. And so Cain is condemned and for having introduced murder in there, and but he becomes, even as a murderer, the ancestor of the Hebrew people, of the Israelite people. And the Lord gives him a mark of Cain. Now, people think the mark of Cain is a blemish because he's a murderer, but it really isn't. What it is identifying him as one of the Lord's chosen and as a wanderer, because the Hebrew people were wanderers, nomads. the term Hebrew probably is a derivative of a Middle Eastern term of Apiru, which meant wanderer, nomad. And they wander and wander, and really until they come and settle in the conquest of Israel after the Exodus. So they are wandering people, and this is just a mark of Cain, that he's a wanderer. Then he has a wife and his own children, and I remember as a kid reading this, I was probably 10 years old, and I didn't understand the different creation stories at the time. I was young, and people didn't talk about it. They just kind of pretended that the stories were literal. And I thought, wait a minute, how does this guy find a wife? Where did this wife come from? Where did these other people come from? Well, the stories aren't to explain everything logically. The stories are to explain where these various ethnic groups come from. Cain is the father of the Hebrew people, where suffering and murder and lust and all these other things come from. And so it's an interesting tidbit in there. And he has a wife, and he has several children, et cetera, et cetera. Then he goes on, and then chapter 5 goes back to the priestly account, and you can see the list of all these genealogies, and everybody lives 1,000,000 years and stuff like that. And I just skip right over that one. Then you go to Noah and the flood. And it's an interesting story, and it's really there to do a couple of purposes. The story is very similar to stories from Babylonian mythology. Now, Babylonian mythology would have floods all the time because Babylon was in the valley where most of Iraq population is now, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They didn't have dams in those days. They had lots of floods, and the flood would be high, and it would wash everybody out. So the flood story is probably borrowed from Babylonian mythology, because you don't have floods where the Hebrews settled. You don't have floods in the highlands of the West Bank, on the west side of the Jordan, and you just don't have enough water there, and the mountains are higher. And so it's really a borrowed thing, and it's to deal, again, with other questions about it. And Noah is favorable on the side of the Lord, and the Lord decides that humans are terrible. That's not hard to understand. That humans are awful, and he's going to punish them, and he's going to destroy them all and have Noah repopulate the earth with less violence. And so he has Noah build an ark. Remember, if you're old enough as I am, you may remember the great routine that Bill Cosby did, a young Bill Cosby did about Noah and building the ark and stuff. And they give dimensions, and it's 300 cubits by 45 cubits or something. And years ago, I was back at Indian Run United Methodist long before I came up to Jerome. Young David Bridgman was the pastor there, and he was talking about this in the sermon, and he looks out over the congregation and said, does anybody know what a cubit is? So I hold up my arm. A cubit is the measurement from the tip of your middle finger to your elbow, basically 18 inches. So I did that, held it up to him, and he kind of looks at me, and on the way out the door after the sermon, he says, I should have known better than ask that question with you in the congregation. And I just laughed, and that was the end of it. It was all in good humor. Because measurements in those days were based on physical measurements. A foot in our system is a foot. A cubit is here to here. A yard is from your nose to the end of the finger. So that's what a cubit is, if you're wondering. And you have the dimensions of how you could build this boat. And you have the rain comes down, and the sluice is open from the underworld, and the water comes up from below, and you have this long, lengthy flood. And it doesn't deal with some of the questions Bill Cosby dealt with, like how do you clean up all the animal droppings in the bottom of the ark? That's not the point of the story. So you eventually have this long time, and they settle in the mountain of Ararat, which actually is Uratur. Uratur is the ancient term for the highlands between Iraq and Iran. Iraq is down in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Iranian are on a plateau, and there's highlands in between them. And that was the original place. This was the mythology from Babylon. That's where they settled on the mountains there, Uratur. Why do you have Mount Ararat in Turkey? Well, that's very simple. That when the Armenians became Christians, 200 or 300 or 400 AD, they looked around in their area, and they looked around and said, well, what's our highest mountain? There it is. We'll call that Mount Ararat. So the Mount Ararat name in Turkey is a post-Christian name that they chose to name from what they had read about in their scriptures. I'm amused to point out to people that if you're familiar with the story of Moses, Moses couldn't enter the Holy Land. And so the God let him go up on Mount Nebo over on the eastern side of the Jordan and overlook the Promised Land. And there's 2 Mount Nebos in Ohio that I can find. One of them down near Athens and one of them over in the southwest. So people name things for what they read in the Bible that aren't necessarily the biblical things. So Moses did not come to Ohio to spot the Holy Land. But the purpose of the story is afterwards, when they land and the water recedes and everybody comes out, God offers a covenant. This is the first of a series of covenants that happen through the scriptures. This is a universal covenant with Noah and all of humanity, because all of humanity is going to descend from Noah in those days if everybody else had been wiped out. And a covenant not to destroy the world by water again. Okay? Then you have and that's the original covenant. Now, the next covenant is made with Abraham. That's a covenant to bless Abraham's descendants, to give them a holy land of their own and where the Holy Land is now. And that's a covenant limited to his descendants who became the various Hebrew people. It's a covenant with Moses on Mount Sinai. You do this, I will be your God, and you will be my people, and you obey these laws, you have no other gods, etc., etc. And that was a covenant unique to the Israelite Hebrew people also. After that comes the Christian covenant, which is back to being universal, because the Christian covenant of salvation through faith in Christ can go anywhere in the world. You have people in Korea and China and Latin America and U.S. and Australia and Africa where the Christians worldwide. So that's a covenant has changed, but the original covenant relationship was with Noah after the flood. And to me, that's really the purpose of the flood story. Then you have this odd story where Noah gets drunk and passes out and is lying there naked, which apparently is an abomination in that time and his son Ham, one of his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and one of the sons comes in and sees him naked, and this is a humiliation for Noah and for the son, and he's angry with the son who sees him naked, and he kind of curses him. Well, Ham becomes, in the mythology, the ancestor of the Canaanite people, the predecessors to the Israelites in the Holy Land, and so by condemning them ethnically through their ancestor Ham, this allows for the ethnic tension as the Israelites attack after the Exodus and come in through over the Jordan and Jericho, and there's a long series of contests for hundreds of years, and they basically drive them out, and they end up fleeing up into the Lebanon area, and this is the curse of Ham is a justification for the ethnic tension with the Canaanite people. And then the final, so a lot of these stories are really wrapped up into setting the stage for why these things happen. Why do we have violence? Why do we have lust? Why do we have to work? Why do we have to struggle to produce our food? Why do we hate our enemies, these people that are on the land that we want to take? So these stories are really set up for a lot of those explanations. And they're going back, and they're beautifully constructed by the priests in the 550 or so BC, taking the old legends and putting them together. The last one is the Tower of Babel, and that's just to answer a question, why do we have so many different languages? So they have a story of trying to build a tower to get to the heaven, to be like God, which is really probably from the old ziggurat, which is the ancient tower in Babylon, and they're trying to act like God, and God decides to punish them by cursing them where they don't understand each other anymore. Now, this is an explanation, attempting to explain the unexplainable as to why we have multiple languages. People who've studied multiple languages now, there's large language groups. There's the Semitic group, Hebrew and Arabic and Syriac and all that. Where English is in the Indo-European group, which goes all the way to Iran and the Armenians, and then comes around all through Europe. And they've been able to define these various language groups, and they're followed migrations, etc. There's a couple non-Indo-European languages that Europe, Finnish and Hungarian and Turkish are in Euro-Altaic, and there's one unique language. You want a trivia question? What's the one unique unrelated language in Europe? That's Basque. If you remember the Basques that lived between the borders of Spain and France and the Pyrenees Mountains. Their language is independent, not related to anything else. So it developed completely on its own. So this is the explanation of the very difficult question of why do we have all these different languages and we struggle to understand each other. In the era of the computer, communication is becoming even more dominant, and you're now finding a lot of English communication. I edit an international medical journal, and everything has to be submitted in English. If their English isn't any good, we send it back and say get somebody to help clean it up. So the issue of languages continues with us even till now. So in summary, these are a series of folk legends to explain the unexplainable, how the earth works, why humans are this way, where did we come from, not even answering where are we going, why do we have ethnic groups that don't like each other, why do we have violence and murder and lust and other sinful behavior in here, and it's an attempt to explain all that. So that's what it is. Scientifically, this is not the answer, but it makes for very interesting reading, and it really is a look inside our soul more than our history as to what makes humans, because we're a challenging species. We make war on each other, we can be brave and generous and kind and supportive and nasty and evil and hateful all at the same time, even in the same people. So it's a very good explanation of attempting to explain the unexplainable. The reading for next week would be Genesis 12, Genesis 13, 16 through 19, and 21. Now, by the way, I sent an email out last time. Somebody had approached me about trying to have some kind of like a Zoom session in the middle of the week where we could answer questions. I do miss the questions and answers, though they're live class. I only had 3 people answer. So I'm not certain whether to even try it. If any of you all are interested in setting something like that, we could even do it simply with a conference call because we don't need to see each other. We all know what each other looks like. Something that do it like on the middle of the week for half an hour. We can do that. If you're interested, let me know. Just send me an email. This is Dr. Guthrie. I'll see you next week. Thank you.